Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the untold stories.
In the days when the Third Age drew toward its meridian, and the memory of Gil-galad's spear had grown dim in the halls of men, there came upon Middle-earth a stillness that was not peace. It was the stillness of a held breath, of eyes that watch from hidden places, of shadows that lengthen though no sun moves across the sky. The Lady Galadriel stood upon the high platform of her tree flet in Caras Galadon, her white robe stirring in a wind that touched no other garment in all the golden wood. Before her lay the mirror of water, still and dark as a pool of starlight. Yet she gazed not into its depths, but beyond them, beyond the malin trees and the flowing celebrant, beyond even the blue peaks of the misty mountains that stood like ancient watchers against the eastern sky. For she had felt it, a tremor in the music, a discord in the harmony that had sustained the world since the first songs were sung in the timeless halls. It was not loud, this wrongness, nor sharp like the bite of winter wind. Rather, it was like the first crack in a great bell, so small that none might notice save those whose ears were tuned to catch the deepest melodies of creation. The golden malin leaves sang their eternal song, yet to her they seemed to sing now of endings rather than of the endless cycle of seasons. The light of Lothlórien, kindled by her own power, and the strength of Nenya upon her hand, flickered as a candle might when a door opens to admit the night. She raised her hand, and the ring of water caught what light remained, casting patterns that danced like flame shadows upon the bark of the great trees. "My lady." The voice came soft as falling leaves, and she turned to see Celeborn ascending the winding stair, his grey eyes troubled beneath silver brows. The borders grow restless. Our guardians speak of shapes that move in the darkness beyond Dol Guldur, and evil dreams trouble the sleep of even our wisest. She nodded, though her gaze had already returned to the eastward distance. "I know it, Lord of this realm. The shadow stirs, and its stirring sends ripples through all the circles of the world. Even here, in this sanctuary, we have woven from light and memory. The darkness presses against our borders like floodwater against a dam." "Is it he?" Celeborn's voice carried the weight of long years and longer memory. "Does the necromancer of Dol Guldur grow bold again?" For a long moment she made no answer. The wind that touched her hair and no other thing in the golden wood seemed to bring with it whispers from afar. The creak of iron gates that had not opened for an age, the echo of footsteps in halls where no foot should tread, the rustle of maps unfolded by hands that cast no shadow. "It is, and it is not," she said at last, and her voice held notes of sorrow that had not sounded since the lamp-lit ships departed from the grey havens. "The enemy we have watched is but a mask, beloved, a seeming woven to hide a greater darkness. I fear our long vigil has been turned against us, our eyes fixed upon the puppet, while the puppet master moves unseen." The mirror at her feet stirred without wind, its surface breaking into rings that spread outward like the ripples from a stone cast into still water. In its depths, shadows moved, not reflections of the world above, but glimpses of possibilities, of paths that might yet unfold in the tapestry of days to come. She saw fire and darkness, the gleam of swords beneath a red sky, and small figures walking roads that led into peril beyond all hope of return. And she wept then, the Lady of Light, tears like crystal that caught the fading radiance of her realm and held it, as if she sought to preserve in those falling drops all the beauty that might soon pass away from the world forever. In the deep places of Fangorn, where the roots of trees run deeper than the memory of men, and the very stones remember the songs that shaped them, Treebeard, The Ent paused in his slow wandering. His great feet, gnarled like the roots of mountains, pressed into earth that had not known the tread of moving things for countless years, and he lifted his ancient head to taste the wind. "Whom hom," he rumbled, a sound like distant thunder rolling through valleys of stone. Something is not right. Something hasty moves in the world, and it is not the wind, nor the turning of seasons, nor the patient growth of green things. The trees around him, oak and ash, birch and lelm, elders of the forest who had stood since the breaking of Thangorodrim, stirred without breeze. Their leaves whispered secrets in the old tongue, speaking of dreams disturbed and roots that felt tremors from afar. In their slow speech, they told of shadows that walked where no shadow should fall, of birds that flew southward though it was not yet their season, of the very sap in their heartwood running cold. Treebeard's eyes, deep as wells that reflect starlight, turned eastward toward the distant misty mountains, and beyond them to lands he had not seen for many turnings of the wheel. "Whom," he said again, and now his voice carried notes of remembering, of stories half forgotten that stirred like seeds in winter earth. The old anger wakes, the long patience breaks, and we, who have slept in the sun and dreamed in the rain, must remember what we once were, when the world was young and we were the shepherds of the trees. He began to move then, not with the measured slowness that had marked his steps for an age of the world, but with something approaching haste, though it would have seemed patience itself to any creature of shorter life. His voice rose in the deep song of the Ents, calling to his folk scattered through the vastness of Fangorn, telling them that the time of watching was ending, and the time of choosing had come. Far to the north, in the grey halls of Rivendell, where the music of water runs eternal through carved stone, Elrond half-elven raised his head from ancient scrolls and felt the echo of that calling. It came not as sound, but as a stirring in the blood, a reminder of oaths spoken in the early days when the free people stood together against the darkness, and the light of the two trees still lived in the memory of the world. "Master Elrond." Eristor appeared at the doorway of the great library, his dark eyes questioning. The horses grow restless in their stalls, and the watch upon the borders sends word of unease among the wild things. Even the stars seem dim tonight, though no cloud obscures their light. Elrond set aside the chronicle he had been reading, an account of the last days of Gil-galad, when the light of the Eldar burned brightest before its fading. "Send word to Glorfindel," he commanded. "Let our riders range wide, but let them go warily. Something walks in the world that should not wake, and its waking sends ripples through all the circles of creation." He moved to the great window that looked out over the valley, where the Bruinen ran silver in the starlight, and the house of Elrond stood like a jewel of peace in a world grown dark. But even here, in this sanctuary guarded by his power and the strength of Vilya upon his hand, he could feel it. The drawing back of light, the slow advance of shadow, the sense that ancient evil stirred in forgotten places. "The heirs of Numenor grow weak," he murmured to the night wind. "The kingdoms of men turn their faces inward, and the old alliances crumble like leaves in autumn. Yet still the watchers keep their vigil, and still the light endures in hidden places. But for how long? For how long?" In the deep silence that followed, it seemed that even the musical waters of Rivendell held their breath, waiting for an answer that might never come. 3 days' ride south of the last bridge, where the great east road runs like a ribbon of grey stone through the brown heath of Rudor, a lone horseman urged his mount through the gathering dusk. His cloak was travel-stained and his hat pulled low, casting shadows over features that might have seemed unremarkable to any chance-met wayfarer, save for the eyes beneath those weathered brows, eyes that held depths like winter seas and the flicker of fires that had burned since the world was young. Gandalf the Grey drove Shadowfax hard that evening. though the great horse showed no sign of weariness despite the leagues they had covered since dawn. The wind of their passage caught the wizard's grey cloak and set it streaming like smoke behind him, and in the rhythm of hoofbeats on ancient stone, there was urgency that had not marked his journeys for many a long year. The message had reached him in the Shire, where he had been walking the green lanes of Hobbiton and taking simple pleasure in simple things. The sound of children's laughter from garden gates, the smell of pipeweed and fresh-baked bread, the comfortable complaints of farmers about weather and taxes, and all the small matters that make up the fabric of peaceful days. But even there, in that place where innocence still dwelt untroubled, he had felt the shadows stirring like a cold wind that touches the back of the neck in a warm room. The summons had come, not in words, but in the call of eagles high overhead, their cries spelling out in the old speech a message that made his blood run cold. The fire wakes, the shadow moves, the wise must gather ere the darkness falls. Now, as Shadowfax bore him eastward, through the wild lands where few roads ran and fewer still travelled them, Gandalf's thoughts turned to the White Council and the debates that had raged in hidden halls for decades uncounted. Too long had they watched and waited, measuring their words while the enemy gathered strength in secret places. Too long had they held back their power, fearing to act lest they themselves become the very tyranny they opposed. But no longer, he murmured to the wind, and his voice carried notes of steel that would have surprised those who knew him only as a wandering conjurer of fireworks and tales. The time of half measures has passed. The time of watching from afar has ended. If the shadow moves, then we must move as well, though it cost us everything we have sought to preserve. The road began to climb now, winding between hills that grew ever steeper and more wild. To the north, the misty mountains reared their snow-crowned heads against the darkening sky, and beyond them, though no eye could see so far, lay Dol Guldur, the hill of sorcery, where malice brooded in towers of black stone, and the very air was poison to all that lived and grew. As the last light faded from the western sky, and the first stars kindled their cold fires overhead, Gandalf felt it again. That wrongness in the very foundations of the world, that sense of something vast and patient stirring in its long sleep. It was like the feeling one might have standing over a volcano that had slept for centuries, feeling the first tremor that spoke of magma rising deep beneath the earth. He drew rein at last upon a high ridge where the road curved around a shoulder of weathered stone, and for a moment he sat motionless in the saddle, his eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon, where darkness lay like a sea of black water. Shadowfax stamped and snorted, tossing his great head as if he too could sense what his rider felt, the stirring of ancient malice, the whisper of a name that should not be spoken, the shadow of a shadow that reached out from hiding to touch the edges of the world. "Come, old friend," Gandalf said at last, gathering the reins in hands that had grown gnarled with the weight of centuries. "We have far to go before we sleep, and the road grows darker with each mile we travel, but we shall not turn aside, though all the hosts of darkness stand in our path. For the flame of Anor burns still, and while it burns, hope endures." And with that, he urged Shadowfax forward into the night, rider and horse becoming one with the darkness that flowed between the hills like a tide of stars. Dawn came grey and cheerless over the Vale of Anduin, where mists rose from the great river like the breath of sleeping giants. Gandalf had ridden through the night without rest, and now he sat upon Shadowfax at the edge of a high bluff, gazing across the brown waters toward the dark eaves of Mirkwood that stretched away into shadow like a sea of twisted nightmares. There, rising from the southern reaches of that accursed forest like a broken tooth in a skull, stood Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, the Naked Hill, the place where shadow had taken root and grown strong in the long years since the watchful peace had ended. Even at this distance, across leagues of water and wild land, The fortress seemed to crouch upon its hill like some monstrous spider, its towers of black stone rising into the grey sky like fingers of accusation against the light. The very air around it seemed to writhe with malice, where the morning sun touched other hills and turned them gold. The light seemed to die before it could reach those walls, as if the stones themselves devoured illumination and gave back only darkness in return. No bird flew in the sky above that place, no green thing grew upon its slopes, and even the river that flowed past its feet ran black and sullen, as if poisoned by proximity to so much concentrated evil. Shadowfax shifted uneasily beneath him, and the great horse's ears lay flat against his skull. No beast born of Middle-earth could look upon Dol Guldur without feeling the weight of its malice, the sense that here dwelt something that hated all living things, with a hatred that burned like the very fires of the earth's foundations. "So," Gandalf murmured, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the long grass. "The necromancer grows bold indeed. No longer does he hide his power beneath a veil of seeming. The very stones of his fortress reek with malice, and the shadow of his presence lies heavy upon all the lands about." Yet even as he spoke, the wizard's keen eyes caught something that troubled him more than all the obvious malice of that accursed place. For there, upon the highest tower of Dol Guldur, something fluttered in the wind. Not a banner or standard, but a shape that moved with purpose, as if it were alive. And though the distance was too great for mortal sight to pierce, Gandalf's eyes were not mortal, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. It was an eye, vast and lidless, wreathed in flame and shadow, that turned its gaze across the lands like a searchlight sweeping the darkness. And in that moment when the eye turned towards him, Gandalf felt a weight settle upon his spirit, like the pressure of deep waters, a malice so pure and concentrated that it seemed to press against his very soul. "I see you," whispered a voice that was not a voice, speaking words that were not words, yet which reached him across all the leagues, between with clarity that cut like a blade. "I see you, Grey Wanderer, Stormcrow, bearer of the flame of Anor. You think to spy upon me from afar, but I have known of your watching for longer than you can guess. Soon I shall have no more need for hiding. Soon the shadow shall cover all the earth, and your little lights shall be snuffed out like candles in a hurricane." For a moment that seemed to stretch into hours, Wizard and Dark Lord stared at each other across the void, and in that exchange of gazes lay all the malice of ages, all the light that yet endured in the world, all the choices that had led to this moment when the darkness finally showed its true face. Then Gandalf turned Shadowfax away from that accursed sight, though it took all his will to break free from the weight of that terrible gaze. Behind him he could feel the eye watching still, boring into his back like a lance of ice and fire, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the time of watching and waiting was over. The war had begun, though no horn had sounded and no sword had yet been drawn. In the simple act of looking and being seen, the lines had been drawn and the sides chosen. Now there remained only the question of whether the light could endure what was to come, or whether all would indeed be devoured by the shadow that spread from that hill of sorcery, like a plague upon the world. Behind him, Dol Guldur brooded in its wreath of malice, and the eye upon its tower turned to gaze upon other lands, seeking other watchers, other enemies to mark for the darkness that was to come. There are places in Middle-earth where the very stones remember pain, where the echo of ancient evils has soaked so deep into earth and rock that they can never be fully cleansed. The entrance to Dol Guldur was such a place. A great archway of black stone carved with runes that hurt the eye to look upon, runes that spoke of dominion and despair in the black speech that should never have been given form in the world of light. Gandalf approached on foot now, having left Shadowfax at the forest edge where clean water still ran and untainted grass still grew. The great horse would go no closer to that accursed place, and the wizard did not blame him. Indeed, with each step he took toward those gaping gates, he felt the weight of malice pressing upon him like a physical thing, as if the very air had grown thick with poison, and every breath burned his lungs with the taste of ash and iron. The silence here was not the peaceful quiet of deep woods or high mountains, but the silence of the tomb, the silence of places where all life has fled and only death remains. No wind stirred the blackened trees that stood like sentinels about the hill's base, their branches twisted into shapes that suggested grasping claws and screaming mouths. No bird sang, no insect hummed, no small creature scurried through the undergrowth. Even the sound of his own footsteps seemed muffled and wrong, as if the earth itself sought to swallow all trace of his passage. The gates stood open, a yawning mouth of darkness that seemed to lead not into corridors and chambers, but into the very void between the stars. No guard was posted, no challenge rang out, for what need had the master of this place for such crude protections? His very presence was guard enough, his malice a barrier more potent than any wall of stone or gate of iron. Yet Gandalf did not hesitate. Drawing his staff close against his body, he whispered words in the ancient tongue of the Eldar, words of protection and warding that had been old when Gil-galad was young. A faint light kindled about him, not bright, but clean, a small defiance against the overwhelming darkness that pressed in from all sides. The corridors beyond the gate were carved from the living rock of the hill, their walls slick with moisture that wept eternally from the stone like tears of despair. The very architecture seemed designed to crush the spirit. Ceilings that pressed low overhead, passages that narrowed without warning, chambers that opened into vast spaces where echoes died away into silence that felt hungry for sound. Deeper he went, following passages that seemed to shift and change when he was not looking directly at them, as if the fortress itself were a living thing that sought to confuse and entrap all who dared enter its depths. The light of his staff threw dancing shadows on the walls, and in those shadows he began to see shapes that should not be. Faces twisted in agony, hands reaching out in supplication, forms that writhed and whispered just beyond the edge of sight. The temperature dropped with each downward step, until his breath began to mist before his face, and frost formed on the walls, despite the moisture that wept from the stone. This was not the clean cold of winter mountains, but the chill of the grave, the cold that creeps into bones and hearts and never leaves them. It was the cold of despair made manifest, of hope frozen in the very act of dying. At last, he came to a great chamber whose vaulted ceiling was lost in shadow overhead. Here the darkness was so complete that even his staff's light seemed to falter, as if the very air sought to devour illumination. The floor was carpeted with bones, not the clean white bones of natural death, but blackened things that crumbled at his touch and left stains upon the stone that would never wash clean. And here, in the heart of this place of desolation, Gandalf finally understood the true scope of what had been hidden in Dol Guldur. This was not merely the fortress of some lesser evil, some necromancer drunk on stolen power. This was a place prepared, a throne room waiting for its master, a stronghold from which to launch the conquest of all the free lands of Middle-earth. In the center of the chamber stood a throne of black iron, its surface inscribed with the same burning runes that adorned the gates above. Though no figure sat upon it, the throne radiated malice-like heat from a forge, and Gandalf could feel the weight of eyes upon him, not the physical eyes that had gazed at him from the tower, but something deeper, more fundamental, a malice that had watched the world since the first shadows fell across the light of creation. He had found the heart of the shadow's power in the south, but he knew now, with terrible certainty, that this was only a part of a greater design, one link in a chain of malice that stretched across all the darkening world. In the deepest cells beneath the throne chamber, where the very foundations of Dol Guldur were carved into the bones of the earth itself, Gandalf found the dungeons. Here the darkness was so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance, pressing against his eyes like black cloth. The air reeked of despair and torment, thick with the accumulated anguish of countless prisoners who had been brought to this place and never seen the sun again. The cells were cut from solid rock, each one sealed with bars of black iron that wept rust like blood in the eternal dampness. Most stood empty now, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. But from one came a sound that made the wizard's heart clench with pity. The soft murmur of a voice speaking words in a tongue he had not heard for many ages of the world. He approached the occupied cell with caution, holding his staff high so that its light might penetrate the shadows within. What he saw there made him draw in his breath sharply, for chained to the wall with bonds of iron and sorcery was a figure that should have been beyond the reach of any earthly power. Thrain, son of Thror, rightful king under the mountain, hung in his chains like a broken doll. His beard, once magnificent and black, was now grey as ash and hung in matted tangles to his chest. His eyes, which had once flashed with the fire of the forge and the pride of his ancient line, were now dim and clouded, staring at visions that existed only in the realm of madness, where his tormentors had driven him. Yet even in his extremity, something of the king he had been still showed through, in the set of his shoulders, in the lift of his chin, in the way he held his head, even bent beneath the weight of years of torment. This was no ordinary prisoner, no captured soldier or unfortunate wanderer. This was one of the line of Durin, blood royal of the Longbeards, and his presence here spoke of plans within plans, of a malice that reached far beyond the borders of Mirkwood. "Who comes to the halls of despair?" Thrain whispered, his voice like the rustle of autumn leaves. "Another victim for the Shadow's games? Another soul to be broken upon the wheel of his malice?" "I am Gandalf the Grey," the wizard said softly, stepping closer to the bars. "I am come from the west, from the lands of light, seeking the source of the shadow that spreads across Middle-earth. Tell me, son of Thror, how came you to this accursed place?" For a moment, recognition flickered in those clouded eyes, like stars glimpsed through breaking storm clouds. "Gandalf, Grey Wanderer, friend of my people." His voice grew stronger, as if the mere presence of one untouched by the Shadow's malice gave him strength to remember who he had been. 7 years I have hung in these chains, 7 years since the Shadow's servants took me on the road to Erebor. 7 years of torment, of questions asked with fire and iron, of truths torn from my lips like flesh from bone. The wizard's heart grew cold with understanding. "What did you tell them, Lord of the Dwarves? What secrets were wrested from you in your pain?" Thrain's head fell forward, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with shame and anguish. "Everything," he whispered. "The hidden ways into the lonely mountain, the secret passages of my fathers, the weakness in Smaug's armor that my grandfather marked with his spear. All of it I gave to them when the pain grew too great to bear. And more than that," he continued, his voice rising to a wail of despair. "He showed me visions. The ring, the precious ring of my fathers, the last key to the secret door of Erebor. I told him where it lay hidden, though I swore I would die before betraying that trust. And now he knows all the ways into the mountain, all the strengths and all the weaknesses of my people's ancient home." Gandalf felt the blood drain from his face as the full scope of the enemy's design became clear. Not content with holding Dol Guldur as a stronghold in the south, the Shadow had been gathering intelligence about every dwarf kingdom, every hidden fastness where the free peoples might make their stand. The capture of Thrain had been no mere chance. It had been planned, calculated, part of a vast strategy that stretched far beyond anything the White Council had imagined. "But there is worse," Thrain said, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to come from the very depths of his tormented soul. "He is not the necromancer we thought him to be. The shadow that rules here is no lesser evil, no mere sorcerer drunk on stolen power. I have looked into his eye, Gandalf the Grey, and I have seen the truth that lies behind the mask he wears." The Dwarf King raised his head, and in his eyes Gandalf saw reflected a knowledge so terrible that it had burned away his sanity like fire burns dry leaves. "He is Sauron," Thrain whispered. "The Dark Lord has returned to Middle-earth, and this fortress is but the first move in a game whose end is the dominion of all the world." In the silence that followed these words, the very stones of Dol Guldur seemed to whisper with malice, as if the name that had been spoken in their depths gave them power to remember older evils, darker truths. And Gandalf knew that the time of hiding was over, the time of preparation at an end. The war for Middle-earth had begun, and its first casualties were already chained in the darkness beneath their feet. The moment Thrain spoke that name, the name that had been whispered in fear for long ages, that had echoed in the councils of the wise like a tolling bell, the very air in the dungeon changed. The shadows deepened, pressing in from all sides as if drawn by some irresistible force, and the temperature plummeted until frost began to form on the iron bars of the cell. Then came the laughter. It began as a whisper, soft as the sound of wind through dead leaves, but it grew and swelled until it filled the chamber with a sound that was not entirely sound, a presence that pressed against the mind like the weight of deep waters. It was the laughter of one who has watched kingdoms rise and fall like waves upon a shore, who has seen the proud brought low and the mighty scattered like dust before the wind. So spoke a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through stone and bone and spirit alike. "The Grey Wanderer comes at last to look upon my works. You have found my prisoner, have you not? You have heard what he has told you of my plans and purposes. Tell me, Mithrandir, for I know your true name, as I know all things that move in the circles of the world. Does what you have learned here please you?" Gandalf raised his staff, and its light blazed brighter, driving back the pressing shadows for a moment. But even as he did so, he felt the vastness of the will that opposed him, the crushing weight of a malice that had endured since the music was first sung in the timeless halls. "I know you, Sauron Gorthor," he said, his voice steady despite the terror that gnawed at the edges of his mind. "I know you for what you are, the Mire fallen, the servant who would be master, the shadow that seeks to devour all light. Your disguise is pierced, your mask torn away. No longer will you hide behind the name of necromancer while you weave your webs of malice in the dark." The laughter came again, colder now, tinged with a mockery that cut like winter wind. "Hide. You think I have been hiding? Foolish wizard, I have been preparing. Every year that you and your White Council have spent in debate and deliberation, I have used to gather my strength, to call my servants from the waste places of the world, to forge the weapons of my victory in fires you cannot imagine." The shadows began to take shape around them, not solid forms, but suggestions of vast malice, of power beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. Gandalf felt himself pressed back against the stone wall, his light failing before the advance of darkness absolute. "You have seen my prisoner," the voice continued, and now there was satisfaction in it, cruel and cutting. "You have heard how easily he broke beneath my questioning, how readily he gave up the secrets of his people. Do you think the sons of Durin are unique in their weakness? Do you think other kings, other guardians of ancient treasures, would prove more stalwart when brought to this place?" Images flickered in the darkness, visions of other captives, other broken kings and proud lords reduced to whimpering shadows of themselves. Gandalf saw the halls of Thranduil burning, the gates of Dale thrown down, the great bridges of Rivendell cracked and fallen into the foaming waters below. "I know where the three are hidden," Sauron whispered, and his voice was like the hiss of water on red-hot iron. "I know who bears them, and when the time comes, I shall take them as I took the seven and corrupted the nine. Vilya, Narya, Nenya, all shall serve me in the end, as all things must serve who would survive in the world I shall make." "You speak of things you do not understand," Gandalf replied, though his voice shook with the effort of speaking against that overwhelming presence. "The three were made in secret, never touched by your hand. They are beyond your reach, as their bearers are beyond your dominion." "Are they?" The mockery in that voice was like acid. "Tell me, Grey Wanderer, when did you last look upon the Shire? When did you last walk the green lanes of that peaceful land and take pleasure in its simple innocence? How long do you think before my servants find their way to those round doors and green hills? How long before the halflings learn what it means to defy the power of Mordor?" The wizard's blood turned to ice in his veins, for he heard in that threat not mere cruelty, but the certainty of one who speaks of plans already set in motion. Somewhere, even now, servants of the Shadow were moving against the Shire, against the very heart of innocence in Middle-earth. "Yes," Sauron breathed, sensing his enemy's sudden terror. "Now you begin to understand the scope of my design. This fortress, this gathering of my power in the south, it is but the first move in a game that shall end with all the world bowing before the throne of Barad-dûr. And you, Mithrandir, shall live to see it, if you can call what you will become living." The presence withdrew then, leaving behind only the echo of mocking laughter and the weight of despair that seemed to press down upon all things in that accursed place. But Gandalf knew that this had been no idle boasting, no mere attempt to spread fear. Every word had carried the weight of truth, the certainty of one who had planned long and carefully and was now ready to unleash his malice upon the world. In the silence that followed Sauron's withdrawal, Gandalf felt the weight of all the ages pressing upon his shoulders. The knowledge of what was coming, the scope of the Shadow's design, the threats against the innocent, the certainty that war could no longer be avoided, threatened to crush his spirit beneath its unbearable burden. But he was Gandalf the Grey, Mithrandir the Pilgrim, one of the Istari sent from the Undying Lands to contest the Shadow's dominion, and he had not come so far to surrender to despair. "Thrain, son of Thror," he said, turning back to the broken king who hung in his chains, like a scarecrow, in a withered field. "I cannot break these bonds with simple strength, for they are wrought with malice and sealed with the power of the Shadow itself. But I can offer you something that even Sauron's malice cannot touch. I can offer you hope." The Dwarf King raised his head, and for a moment the madness cleared from his eyes like clouds parting before the sun. "Hope," he whispered. "What hope can there be for one who has betrayed all the trusts placed in his keeping? What hope for a king who gave up his people's secrets to save himself from pain?" "The hope that your sacrifice will not be in vain," Gandalf replied, and as he spoke he began to draw upon the power that lay within him. Not the power of magic or sorcery, but the deeper power that came from his nature as one of the Maiar, a flame of the imperishable fire that had been kindled in the first days of creation. The light about his staff grew brighter, no longer the simple radiance of a wizard's trick, but something pure and clean that drove back the shadows not through force, but through its very nature. This was the light that had shone in the lamps of the Valar before the making of the sun and moon, the light that had illuminated the halls of Valinor when the world was young. "I cannot free you from these chains," he said, his voice growing stronger as the light grew brighter. "But I can ensure that the knowledge you have given to the enemy will not serve his ends." I can kindle a flame that will burn away his certainty, scatter his plans, and give the free peoples of Middle-earth the chance they need to stand against the darkness. The shadows recoiled from that light as if it were a physical thing, writhing and hissing like serpents exposed to flame. Gandalf raised his staff high, and the radiance blazed forth with such intensity that the very stones of Dol Guldur began to crack and tremble. "You dare!" Sauron's voice roared through the fortress, no longer mocking, but filled with rage and something that might almost have been fear. "You dare to kindle the flame of Anor within my halls. You are but one of the Astari, Grey Wanderer, and I am Sauron the Mighty. I am—" "You are nothing!" Gandalf shouted, and his voice carried the authority of one who had walked in the light of the two trees and spoken with the powers that shaped the world. "You are a shadow, a mockery, a corruption of what you once were. You are Sauron the Deceiver, the Abhorred, the fallen Maiar who sought to chain the music to his will and instead became enslaved to his own malice." The light blazed higher, and now it filled the entire chamber, driving back the darkness that had reigned there for so long. The very foundations of Dol Guldur shook as that pure radiance touched them, for the fortress had been built with malice and sustained by shadow, and now it faced something that was anathema to its very existence. "You think this display will avail you?" Sauron's voice was strained now, stretched thin by the effort of maintaining his presence in the face of that cleansing fire. "You think one wizard with one staff can undo the work of centuries? I have prepared for this day, Grey Fool. I have other strongholds, other servants, other designs that are already set in motion. Destroy this place if you will, I shall build it again elsewhere, stronger than before." "Perhaps," Gandalf replied, and now his voice was sad rather than fierce, touched with the sorrow of one who sees clearly what must come. "But you will build it without the advantage of secrecy, without the luxury of time, without the certainty that your enemies are blind to your purposes. The White Council shall be summoned, the guardians of the free lands warned, the ancient alliances renewed. You have shown your hand too soon, Dark Lord, and in that showing lies the seed of your undoing." The light reached its crescendo then, blazing like a star fallen to earth, and in that moment the power of Dol Guldur was broken. The walls cracked, the towers swayed, and the very hill upon which the fortress stood shuddered as if the earth itself sought to cast off the burden of evil that had been placed upon it. But even as victory seemed within reach, Gandalf felt the shadow withdrawing, not destroyed, but departing, flowing out of Dol Guldur like water from a broken vessel, seeking other vessels to fill with its malice. The physical fortress might fall, the immediate threat might be ended, but the true war was only beginning. Through the blazing light, he heard Sauron's voice one last time, distant now, but filled with dark promise. "Enjoy your victory, Mithrandir. It shall be the last you know. When next we meet, it shall be upon the field of your choosing, and all the lights of heaven shall not save you from the darkness I shall bring." And then the presence was gone, leaving behind only the crumbling stones of Dol Guldur and the echoing silence of a fortress suddenly emptied of its malice. But Gandalf took no joy in the victory, for he knew that this was only the end of the beginning, and the true test of the light was yet to come. The great chamber of Rivendell had been wrought for council and contemplation, its pillars carved from living stone, and its high windows opened to catch the music of falling water and the whisper of wind through leaves. Starlight filtered through crystal panes, casting patterns of silver and shadow upon the floor where the White Council had gathered in urgent session. The first such gathering in many years, called by Gandalf's desperate summons from the ruins of Dol Guldur. Elrond sat in the high seat, his grey eyes grave beneath the silver circlet that marked his lordship over the last homely house. To his right stood Galadriel, Lady of Lothlórien, beautiful and terrible as the sea in storm, her golden hair catching the starlight like captured flame. At the table's foot sat Saruman the White, chief of the Astari, his robes pristine and his staff gleaming with power. Yet something in his bearing spoke of impatience, barely held in check. Radagast the Brown was there as well, his earth-stained robe smelling of forest loam and growing things. And scattered about the chamber were other members of the council: Círdan the shipwright from the Grey Havens, Thranduil of the Woodland Realm, and lords of the Eldar whose names were written in the early histories of the world. Gandalf stood in their midst, still bearing the dust of his long ride from the east, still marked by the shadow he had faced in the depths of that accursed fortress. He had spoken for long hours, telling all he had seen and learned, revealing the true identity of the necromancer and the scope of the threat that faced all the free peoples of Middle-earth. Now silence filled the chamber, heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. "So," Saruman said at last, his voice measured and controlled, "you claim that this shadow in Dol Guldur is indeed Sauron returned, the Dark Lord of Mordor risen again to trouble the world. These are grave accusations, Mithrandir, built upon the ravings of a broken dwarf king and visions seen in darkness. Would you have us overturn all our carefully laid plans based upon such uncertain evidence?" Gandalf's eyes flashed, but he kept his voice level. "I have looked upon him with my own eyes, Saruman the White. I have heard his voice, felt the crushing weight of his malice, seen the scope of his design. This is no necromancer, no lesser evil drunk on stolen power. This is Sauron himself, and he has been gathering strength while we debated and deliberated." "And you claim to have driven him from his fortress," Saruman continued, his tone carrying subtle mockery. "You, alone among the Astari, accomplished what all our combined might had not dared attempt. Forgive me if I find such boasts difficult to credit." The Lady Galadriel rose from her seat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of one who had looked upon the light of Valinor before its fading. "Peace, Curunir. The Grey Wanderer speaks truth. I have seen it in the mirror of water, felt the ripples of his deed spread across all the circles of the world. The shadow has indeed fled from Dol Guldur, though whether it has been destroyed or merely displaced remains to be seen." "Then we are agreed," Elrond said, his voice weighted with years and sorrow. "The time of watching has ended. If indeed Sauron has returned, then we must act, and act swiftly, before his malice spreads beyond all hope of containing." But Saruman shook his head, his white robes rustling with his movement. "Act? And how would you have us act, Lord Elrond? Would you have us march openly to war against an enemy whose strength we cannot measure? Would you have us reveal ourselves to friend and foe alike, abandoning the wise restraint that has served us for so long?" "I would have us remember our purpose," Gandalf said, his voice growing heated. "We were not sent to Middle-earth to hide in safety while evil grows unchecked. We were sent to guide and guard, to kindle hope where despair takes root, to stand against the shadow wherever it may fall." Saruman's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Sent? By whom, Grey Wanderer? The Valar who withdrew from Middle-earth long ago? The powers who left this world to work out its own salvation or damnation? We are on our own here, and we must act with wisdom rather than rashness, with patience rather than haste." "While you counsel patience," Gandalf replied, his staff beginning to gleam with inner light, "the enemy marshals his forces. While you speak of wisdom, his servants move against the innocent. How long before his malice reaches the Shire? How long before the children of Hobbiton wake to find orcs at their gates?" "The Shire?" Saruman's voice carried surprise, and perhaps something else. A flicker of interest that came and went too quickly to read. What threat could Sauron pose to that provincial backwater? Surely his attention would be fixed upon greater prizes. Rivendell, Lothlórien, the Lonely Mountain? "He knows of the three," Galadriel said quietly, and her words fell into the chamber, like stones cast into still water. I sense it in the patterns of possibility, in the shadows that gather about the holders of the rings of power. He seeks them as once he sought the 7 and the 9, and he will not scruple to threaten the innocent to achieve his ends. The silence that followed was deeper than before, pregnant with implications that none wished to voice. If Sauron indeed knew of the 3 rings and their bearers, then no sanctuary was safe, no hiding place secure. The war they had long dreaded was not merely coming, it had already begun. Then what would you have us do? Saruman asked at last, and now his voice carried a note of genuine concern beneath its surface composure. If we cannot stand against him in open war, and we cannot hide from his searching eye, what path remains to us? Gandalf turned to face them all, and in his grey eyes burned a fire that spoke of purpose renewed and resolve strengthened by trial. We prepare, he said simply. We gather our allies, strengthen our defenses, and kindle what lights we may against the darkness that is coming. And we trust that when the test comes, courage will prove stronger than fear, hope brighter than despair, and that small hands may yet accomplish what all the armies of the mighty cannot achieve. The council debated long into the night, but the seeds of action had been planted, and already plans were taking shape in the minds of the wise. The war for Middle-earth had begun, and though none could see its end, all understood that there was no turning back from the path that lay before them. In the blue-grey hours before dawn, when the last stars faded from the sky above the misty mountains, and the first hint of light touched the eastern peaks, Gandalf rode forth from Rivendell with purpose burning bright in his heart. The council had spoken long of patience and preparation, of the need for careful thought and measured response, but the wizard knew that time was the one luxury they could not afford. Behind him lay the ancient refuge of the Elves, wrapped in its veils of peace and protection, but ahead lay the wild lands where dwarf lords ruled in halls of stone, and kings remembered grudges older than the trees. If the free peoples were to stand against the shadow, they must stand together, and the bonds that would unite them must be forged in the fires of common purpose before the enemy could strike. The road to Ered Luin was long and lonely, winding through valleys where mist clung to the rivers like the breath of sleeping giants. Here and there, Gandalf passed the ruins of older kingdoms, broken towers that had once watched the passes, crumbling bridges that had once carried the trade of nations, grass-grown foundations where proud cities had stood before the darkness swept them away. These ruins spoke to him of the cost of division, of what happened when the free peoples turned their faces away from each other and trusted to their own strength alone. He would not see such desolation spread across all the lands of the West. He would not watch from safety while darkness devoured the innocent and the proud alike. At the gates of Thorin's halls in the Blue Mountains, the guards looked upon the grey wanderer with suspicion. Dwarves had long memories, and they remembered well the tales of wizards who came bearing gifts with hidden prices, of counsel that led to glory and ruin in equal measure. "Tell your lord that Gandalf the Grey comes calling," he said to the captain of the guard, a grizzled dwarf whose beard was white as mountain snow. "Tell him I bring word of his grandfather's fate, and tidings that concern the future of all the dwarf kindreds." The great doors of iron and stone swung open at last, revealing halls that were both magnificent and melancholy, carved with skill that rivaled the work of Khazad-dûm in its glory, yet marked everywhere with the signs of exile and diminishment. The dwarves who dwelt here were masterful still, their forges bright with fire and their workshops filled with the ring of hammer on anvil. Yet all who looked upon them could see the longing in their eyes for the homeland they had lost. Thorin Oakenshield sat upon a throne of black granite, his dark eyes brooding beneath heavy brows, his hands resting upon the arms of his seat like a king in waiting. He was young as dwarves counted years, yet already he bore the weight of kingship in exile. the burden of a crown that existed more in hope than in reality. "So," he said when Gandalf was brought before him, his voice carrying the deep rumble of mountain stone. "The Grey Wanderer comes to my halls at last. I have heard tales of your wanderings, wizard. How you appear when great deeds are stirring, how you vanish when the price of those deeds must be paid. What brings you to the Blue Mountains? What do you seek among the exiled children of Durin?" Gandalf leaned upon his staff, studying the young dwarf lord with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms. Here was pride, yes, and anger at the losses his people had endured, but beneath it lay something else. A fire that burned bright and clean, a determination that would not bend easily to despair. "I seek what all who love freedom must seek in these dark days," he replied. "I seek allies against the shadow, friends who will stand when standing seems hopeless, hearts brave enough to kindle light in the gathering darkness." Thorin's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Allies? Look around you, wizard. See how the mighty have aided the House of Durin in our exile. Where were the Elves when Smaug came down from the north like a hurricane of fire? Where were the men of Dale when our people died in the dragon's flames? We learned long ago that we can trust none save ourselves." "Your grandfather trusted me," Gandalf said quietly, and at those words Thorin's expression changed, the mask of kingly composure slipping to reveal the pain beneath. "Thrain, son of Thror, counted me friend, and I counted him the same. Would you hear what became of him? Would you know how he spent his final years?" For a long moment silence filled the hall, broken only by the distant sound of hammers from the forges below. Then Thorin nodded and Gandalf began to speak. Not of the torment and madness, not of the broken king chained in darkness, but of courage that endured beyond hope, of royal blood that flowed undiminished even in defeat. "He spoke of you in his final hours," Gandalf concluded, drawing from his robes a simple ring of silver and adamant, set with a single blue stone that caught the torchlight like captured starfire. "He gave me this to bring to you, the last key of Erebor, the symbol of your people's right to the mountain. Tell my grandson," he said, "that the king under the mountain lives still, waiting for the courage to reclaim what was lost." Thorin took the ring with trembling hands, his eyes fixed upon its simple beauty, as if it held all the hopes and dreams of his people. When he looked up again, the fire in his gaze burned brighter than before. "The path to Erebor leads through Mirkwood," he said slowly, "through lands crawling with spiders and orcs, past the very gates of Dol Guldur itself. No company of dwarves, however brave, could force that passage unopposed." Gandalf smiled, and for the first time since leaving Rivendell, he felt hope stirring in his heart. "Perhaps," he said, "but who spoke of forcing passage? There are other roads than those that armies take, other keys than those that open locks. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest steps, and the mightiest victories are won not by the strong, but by the brave." The seed had been planted. Now it remained to see what manner of tree would grow from it, and whether its roots would prove strong enough to weather the storms that were surely coming. The road westward from the Blue Mountains wound through country that grew gentler with each passing mile, leaving behind the stark grandeur of stone peaks for rolling hills clothed in green. Here the scars of ancient wars had long since healed beneath grass and wildflowers, and the only sounds that broke the peaceful silence were the songs of larks and the distant lowing of cattle in meadows where no shadow fell. As Shadowfax carried him through this pleasant land, Gandalf found his thoughts turning to a conversation long past, to words spoken in innocence by one who had no notion of the great affairs that moved in the world beyond his garden gate. It had been decades since he had last walked the lanes of Hobbiton, yet he remembered with perfect clarity the round door of green, the brass knob polished bright as gold, and the gentleman of leisure who lived beyond that threshold. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, respectable, predictable, comfortable in all the small certainties that made up the fabric of Shire life. A hobbit who took his meals at proper times, who kept his garden neat and his pantry well stocked, who had never ventured further from home than Bywater Market and considered that quite far enough. Thank you very much. Yet there had been something in that hobbit's eyes, some flicker of curiosity quickly suppressed, some hint that beneath the layers of respectability lay dreams that had never quite been smothered. And there had been his mother's blood. Belladonna, Took, who had run wild in her youth and filled her father's house with tales of adventure and wonder before settling down to the sensible business of marriage and motherhood. The Tooks had always been a queer family, different from the other hobbits of the Shire in ways that showed most clearly when the wind blew from beyond the borders of their green country. There was old Took blood in Bilbo Baggins, and such blood did not run quiet forever, no matter how deeply it might be buried beneath layers of convention and comfort. But what use is a hobbit in the great affairs of the world? He murmured to the wind, voicing the doubt that had plagued him since leaving Thorin's halls. What can one small creature accomplish that all the armies of the wise cannot? Yet even as he spoke the words, he knew the answer. It was not strength that would win the war to come, nor wisdom, nor the accumulated might of ages. It was something smaller and more precious. The courage of the innocent, the stubbornness of those who refuse to yield to despair, the light that burns in humble hearts and cannot be extinguished by all the malice in the world. The Shire lay before him now, a green jewel set in the crown of a peaceful land, its borders marked not by walls or fortresses, but by hedge and stream and the simple certainty that here dwelt folk who asked nothing more of life than the right to tend their gardens and raise their children in peace. It was a small realm by the standards of the great world, easily overlooked, easily dismissed, and perhaps, for that very reason, precious beyond all measure. As he rode through Hobbiton in the gathering dusk, past windows golden with lamplight and gardens heavy with the scent of evening flowers, Gandalf felt something ease in his spirit that had been tight-wound since his confrontation with the Shadow. Here was innocence that had not yet been touched by fear, joy that needed no reason beyond itself, peace that asked for nothing more than to be left undisturbed. Yet how long would such peace endure? How long before the Shadow's servants found their way to these green hills? How long before the round doors of the Shire opened to admit darkness instead of welcome? He dismounted before the green door of Bag End as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and for a long moment he stood in the garden, breathing in the scent of roses and listening to the comfortable sounds of a household settling into evening. The rattle of dishes being cleared, the soft murmur of a voice reading aloud, the whistle of a kettle beginning to sing. Such simple sounds, yet they spoke of all that was worth defending in Middle-earth. They spoke of life lived without fear, of communities bound together by love rather than necessity, of the quiet heroism that bloomed in places where war was nothing more than a tale told by firelight. Tomorrow he would call upon Bilbo Baggins, would invite himself in for tea and cake and comfortable conversation about weather and gardens and all the small matters that loomed large in the ordered world of the Shire. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate work of awakening adventure in a heart that had slept long in the cradle of contentment. But tonight he would simply stand in this garden and remember what it meant to hope. Not the grim hope of the warrior facing overwhelming odds, but the bright hope of those who trust that morning will come again, that spring will follow winter, that the darkness is only a passing thing and cannot touch the eternal light that dwells in the hearts of the innocent. In the house beyond the green door, a voice began to sing, a simple song of no particular meaning, a melody that spoke of nothing more momentous than the pleasure of a full belly and a warm hearth. Yet to Gandalf's ears it was the most beautiful music in all the world, for it was the song that the Shadow sought to silence and the song that all their struggle was meant to preserve. Let Sauron gather his armies in the east. Let the Nazgul ride forth from Minas Morgul. Let all the hosts of darkness array themselves for war. Here in this garden, in this house, in this small corner of a vast and troubled world, the true victory had already been won. The victory of those who choose love over fear, hope over despair, and who sing in the darkness because they know that no shadow can last forever. The morning when everything changed dawned fair and bright over Hobbiton, with dewdrops catching the early sunlight like scattered diamonds on the grass. In his study at Bag End, Bilbo Baggins sat in his favourite chair by the window, reading the Morning Post and thinking pleasant thoughts about second breakfast, when a sharp rap came at his green door. Outside stood Gandalf the Grey, tall and imposing in his pointed hat and staff, yet somehow different from the kindly conjurer who had delighted hobbit children with his fireworks in years past. There was an urgency about him now, a sense of great affairs stirring just beyond the comfortable borders of the Shire. "Good morning," said Bilbo, though something in the wizard's bearing made the greeting feel uncertain, as if the very concept of a good morning had suddenly become a matter for debate. What followed was a conversation that would echo through the ages. A careful dance of words between wizard and hobbit, a seemingly casual suggestion that took root in fertile ground and began to grow towards something neither participant could have fully foreseen. By the time Gandalf departed, Bilbo wore upon his door a strange mark, a rune that would be read by eyes trained to see such things, and in his heart burned a tiny flame of something that might have been excitement or might have been terror. The dwarves came at evening, 13 of them led by Thorin Oakenshield in his deep blue hood, their faces marked by exile and their eyes bright with the fire of desperate hope. They filled Bilbo's comfortable parlour with their massive forms and their talk of dragons and treasure, of ancient wrongs and the promise of reclamation. Gandalf watched from the corner as Thorin spread upon the table a map drawn on skin that had seen many years. Thror's map of the secret ways into Erebor, marked with runes that spoke of hidden doors and forgotten passages. The very parchment seemed to whisper of old glories and older sorrows, of a kingdom lost and a king who had died beneath a dragon's fire. "The prophecy speaks of a time when the dwarves shall return to the mountain," Thorin said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "When the king under the mountain shall come into his own, and the halls of our fathers shall ring once again with the sound of hammer and song. That time is now. I feel it in my bones. Read it in the signs that multiply about us." Balin, eldest of the company save Thorin himself, leaned forward to trace the paths marked upon the map. "The front gate is sealed with dragon's flame, and the river gate is watched by the worm's hungry eye. But here," his finger touched a seemingly blank section of the mountainside, "here is the secret entrance that our people made in the elder days. 5 feet high, and 3 may walk abreast, if the door can be found, and if the key still turns in its lock." The key lay upon the table beside the map, the same key that Gandalf had carried from the dungeons of Dol Guldur, silver and adamant wrought into a shape both beautiful and terrible. In the firelight it seemed to pulse with its own inner radiance, as if it remembered the touch of royal hands and the weight of kingly purpose. But the door opens only when the light of Durin's Day falls upon the keyhole, Dwalin rumbled, his scarred hands clenched upon his knees. And Durin's Day comes but once a year, when the last moon of autumn and the sun shine in the same sky. Miss that moment, and we must wait another year, if we live to see it. Bilbo found himself drawn into their planning, despite his better judgment, caught up in the sweep of their passion and the grandeur of their design. These were not the comfortable, predictable folk of his acquaintance, content with small pleasures and smaller ambitions. These were the children of kings, the heirs of glory, and they spoke of deeds that would echo in song for generations uncounted. Yet beneath their brave words, he sensed something else, a desperation that bordered on madness, a need so deep it threatened to devour all who came within its reach. They spoke of reclaiming Erebor not as an adventure but as a necessity, as if their very souls depended upon seeing their ancient home restored to its former glory. "It will be dangerous," Gandalf said quietly, his eyes fixed upon Bilbo's face. "The road to Erebor leads through lands where evil things dwell, past ruins where shadows gather and whisper of old defeats. Many who set out upon such a journey never see home again." "But some do," Thorin replied, and his voice carried the iron certainty of one who has staked everything upon a single throw of the dice. "Some return bearing tales of wonder, treasures beyond imagining, deeds that shall be remembered when all other things are forgotten. The question is not whether the road is dangerous. All roads worth traveling are dangerous. The question is whether the destination justifies the peril." Bilbo looked around the circle of weathered faces, saw the hope and fear warring in their eyes, felt the weight of decision settling upon his shoulders like a cloak he had never asked to wear. Outside his window, the Shire slept in peaceful ignorance, wrapped in dreams of harvest and market day, while in his parlor the seeds of legend took root in soil he had thought too comfortable to grow anything but vegetables. In the end, it was not courage that decided him, nor greed, nor any of the grand motives that drive the heroes of ancient songs. It was something smaller and more human. The simple recognition that sometimes a person must step outside the circle of lamplight and walk into the darkness. Not because they are brave, but because someone must, and they happen to be the one standing closest to the door. The contract was signed with hands that trembled only slightly, witnessed by firelight and sealed with hope. When the dwarves departed into the night, Bilbo sat alone in his ravaged parlor, surrounded by the debris of his comfortable life, and wondered what manner of madness had possessed him to agree to such a thing. But in his heart, beneath the fear and the doubt and the certainty that he had made a terrible mistake, something else stirred, something that might have been his mother's blood awakening at last, or might have been nothing more than the ancient call of the road that speaks to all who have ever wondered what lies beyond the next hill. The quest was set, the die was cast, and somewhere in the east, the dragon slept on, unaware that 13 dwarves and a hobbit had begun the long journey that would end at his door. Deep beneath the roots of the lonely mountain, in chambers that had once rung with the songs of dwarf lords and the music of hammer upon anvil, Smaug the Mighty stirred in his sleep. For 60 years he had lain coiled upon his bed of gold, dreaming the dreams of dragons, dreams of fire and dominion, of lesser creatures cowering before his terrible majesty, of treasures that glittered like captured stars in the darkness of his hoard. But tonight his dreams were troubled by whispers that came from no earthly source, by visions of small figures walking roads that led towards his domain, by the echo of voices speaking his name in tones of desperate determination. Something moved in the world beyond his mountain fastness, something that touched the very edges of his awareness, like a moth brushing against the flame of a candle. One great golden eye opened in the darkness, pupil dilating to catch what little light filtered down through cracks in the ancient stone. The dragon's head rose from its resting place atop a mound of coins and cups, sending cascades of treasure spilling across the chamber floor with a sound like metallic rain. His nostrils flared, tasting the air for scents that did not belong: iron and leather, travel stains, and the musk of creatures who dwelt in lands far from the desolation he had made. "Who dares?" he rumbled, his voice a bass note that resonated through stone and bone alike, setting loose stones to falling in forgotten passages. "Who dares to dream of Smaug? Who dares to speak the name of the king under the mountain as if it were something more than memory and ash?" His great form uncoiled slowly, muscles rippling beneath scales that caught the dim light like burnished copper. He was vast beyond the nightmares of mortal kind, serpentine and terrible, wreathed in power that had been old when the dwarves first delved their halls beneath the earth. His wingspan, when fully extended, could shadow half the mountain, and his breath could melt the very stones of the passages where dwarf children had once played at hide and seek. Yet it was not his size alone that made him terrible, but the intelligence that burned behind those golden eyes, a cunning born of ages of solitude and contemplation, sharpened by the accumulated wisdom of stolen treasure and murdered kings. He knew the ways of lesser creatures as a cat knows the ways of mice, and he delighted in their terror as much as in their treasure. But tonight, for the first time in decades, that terrible intelligence was troubled by uncertainty. The whispers that had awakened him spoke not of thieves or armies. Such crude threats he could have dismissed with contempt. They spoke of something else, something that touched the very foundations of his dominion over the lonely mountain. He began to move through his domain, his great form sliding through passages carved wide for the passage of dwarf lords in their pomp. Chamber after chamber he visited, testing the air, listening for sounds that should not be, searching for signs of intrusion into his jealously guarded realm. The hoard stretched before him in all directions, not merely gold and silver, but the accumulated treasures of a kingdom in its glory, artifacts of beauty and power that had been wrought in the elder days when craft was raised to the level of art. Here lay the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, blazing with inner fire that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the dragon's own heartbeat. Here were mail shirts wrought with such skill that they turned the edge of any blade, cups that had graced the tables of kings, weapons that had drunk the blood of orcs in the wars of the elder days. All of it his, taken in fire and slaughter, guarded with jealous fury against any who might dare to claim it. Yet as he moved through his realm of gold and shadow, Smaug felt something he had not experienced in the long years of his dominion. Doubt. Not fear, for what was there in all Middle-earth that could make a dragon fear? But doubt, a nagging certainty that the order he had imposed upon the world through terror and flame was somehow under threat. "The old king is dead," he murmured to himself, his voice echoing strangely in the vaulted chambers. "I smelled his death smoke upon the wind decades ago. His son fled into exile, broken and defeated. His grandson is a pretender, a beggar king without realm or crown. What threat could such as he pose to the majesty of Smaug?" But even as he spoke the words, he felt their hollowness. Something moved in the world beyond his mountain, something that had not been there before. The very air tasted different, charged with possibilities that set his teeth on edge and made his ancient heart beat faster in his massive chest. He settled back upon his hoard at last, but sleep would not come easily. Instead, he lay with one eye open, watching the shadows that danced on the chamber walls, listening to sounds that might have been the settling of old stone, or might have been something else entirely. Far above, on the windswept slopes of the mountain, small birds took flight without apparent cause, fleeing southward as if driven by some instinct older than thought. In the ruins of Dale, where grass grew between broken stones and wild things made their dens in fallen houses, wolves lifted their heads to howl at stars that seemed dimmer than before. The dragon was awake, and all the lands about the lonely mountain felt the weight of his stirring. But he was not the only ancient power that sensed change upon the wind. In other dark places, other eyes opened to study the shifting patterns of fate and fortune. The time of long peace was ending, and the players in the great game were beginning to move. Smaug coiled tighter about his treasure, his golden eyes fixed upon the passages that led to the outer world, and for the first time in 60 years, he truly understood that his long solitude might soon be broken. Whether that breaking would bring him new victims to torment or new threats to crush remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the days of undisturbed slumber were over. In the depths of the mountain the fire awakened, and Middle-earth would never be the same. While Smaug stirred in his halls of gold and a small company walked the roads of adventure, other powers moved in the darkness beyond the borders of the free lands. From Dol Guldur, the shadow had fled, but it had not been destroyed, merely displaced, like water poured from one vessel into another, and the vessel that now contained that malice was vaster and more terrible than any fortress built by mortal hands. In the land of Mordor, where shadows lie, the dark tower of Barad-dûr rose black against the red sky, like a spear thrust up from the very bowels of the earth. Its foundations ran deeper than the roots of mountains, and its peak was lost in clouds that never broke to admit the light of sun or star. Here was the true seat of the power that had fled from Dol Guldur, the ancient stronghold from which Sauron had once sought to impose his will upon all the circles of the world. The tower had stood empty for long ages, its black gates sealed and its passages echoing with nothing but wind and memory. But now those gates swung open once again, revealing chambers that reeked of malice made manifest, halls where the very stones whispered of dominion and despair. The Dark Lord had returned to claim his inheritance, and all the hosts of darkness stirred at his call. From the pits of Isengard came the sound of hammers upon anvils, as Saruman the White, no longer white, though few yet knew it, began the work of transforming his domain into an engine of war. The peaceful gardens were torn up to make way for furnaces, the crystal pools polluted with the runoff of forges that worked day and night without ceasing. Orcs walked openly in the ring of Isengard now, no longer hiding their presence from the eyes of birds or the whispers of wind. In the misty mountains, the goblins grew bold, emerging from their tunnels to raid and pillage lands that had known peace for generations. They bore weapons of strange device, forged in fires that burned with unnatural colors, and they fought with art, coordination that spoke of a single will directing their movements. No longer were they mere bandits and raiders. They had become an army, disciplined and deadly, waiting for the word that would send them streaming down into the vales below. Even in the far north, where the Iron Hills marched along the borders of the Grey Mountains, sentries reported strange lights in the sky and the sound of horns blown in no earthly key. The wild men of Rhûn were stirring, gathering in great camps beyond the sight of civilized folk, while from the south came tales of the Southrons, mustering their Mumakil, and the corsairs of Umbar fitting out their black ships for war. But it was in Minas Morgul, the tower of black sorcery that crouched like a pale spider on the borders of Ithilien, that the greatest preparations were being made. Here dwelt the Nine, the Nazgûl, the ring-wraiths who had once been kings of men before their pride brought them low and their greed delivered them into slavery. For long years they had hidden in that accursed valley, nursing their hatred and perfecting their malice. But now they stirred like corpses awakening in their tombs. The Lord of the Nazgûl, the Witch King of Angmar, stood upon the topmost battlement of the dead city and gazed westward toward the lands of the living. Once he had been a king among men, mighty in war and wise in counsel, but that was before the gift of the Nine Rings had taught him that power could be bought with any price, even the surrendering of one's soul. Now he was something else entirely, neither living nor dead, sustained by malice, and bound by oaths that could never be broken. His crown was wrought of iron and shadow, his sword blazed with cold fire that could cut through flesh and spirit alike, and his voice was the sound of winter wind through empty halls. "The time approaches," he whispered to his 8 companions, his words carrying across the veil like the promise of plague. "Our master has returned to claim his inheritance, and we shall ride forth once more to harvest the terror we have so long sown. The west shall burn, and the thrones of the free peoples shall be cast down into the dust." One by one, the other Nazgûl emerged from the shadows where they had been brooding, their forms wrapped in black robes that seemed to drink light itself. Each bore a blade forged in the fires of their hatred. Each wore a crown that marked their former greatness and their present shame. They had been the mightiest of their age, and their fall had been all the more terrible for the heights from which they had descended. "What of the three?" asked one, his voice like the hiss of air through broken teeth. "What of the rings that were made in secret, that never felt the touch of our master's hand?" The Witch King laughed, a sound like ice cracking in the depths of winter. "They think themselves hidden, protected by the strength of their bearers and the wisdom of the Eldar. But we have been patient, and patience is rewarded in the end. When the moment comes, we shall take them, not by force, for they are beyond our power to seize directly, but by breaking the will of those who bear them. Even the wise can be brought to despair, and in despair all defenses crumble." Above them, the dead light of Minas Morgul pulsed like a diseased heart, casting sickly radiance across a landscape where nothing good could grow. The very air reeked of corruption, and the stones of the city wept tears that burned like acid where they fell. This was the antithesis of all that was fair and growing in the world, the negation of hope made manifest in tower and wall. Yet even as the Nine prepared for the war to come, they knew that their time had not yet arrived. The pieces of the great game were still moving toward their appointed places, and their master's design required patience, even from his most terrible servants. The dragon still slumbered on his gold, the dwarves still walked their road of adventure, and the small folk of the Shire still tended their gardens in peaceful ignorance. But that peace would not endure much longer. Already the shadow was spreading, touching the dreams of the innocent with nightmares, whispering to the proud that their strength was greater than their wisdom, sowing the seeds of discord that would bloom into open war when the season was ripe. The blade was not yet drawn, but the hand was already on the hilt, and when at last it flashed in the darkness, all the world would feel the edge of its cutting. The death of Smaug the Terrible came not as the songs would later tell it, not in a great battle with armies arrayed and banners flying, but in fire and fury above the waters of Long Lake, where the last descendant of Dale's kings drew his bow with aim made true by courage and desperation in equal measure. The dragon's roar of agony echoed across all the lands about the lonely mountain, a sound that spoke of an age ending and a new chapter beginning in the long history of Middle-earth. When the great worm's death throes had stilled and his corpse lay cooling in the shattered remains of Lake Town, a silence fell over the lands that had known his dominion. It was not the peaceful quiet of evening or the restful hush of snowfall, but the stunned stillness that follows the ending of a nightmare that has lasted too long to remember what waking felt like. In the halls beneath the mountain, where Dragonfire had sealed the gates and dragon fear had kept all intruders at bay, new voices began to echo for the first time in 60 years. The company of Thorin Oakenshield walked passages that their grandfathers had carved, stood in chambers where their people had once sung the songs of their craft and their glory. The sound of their footsteps rang strange in that vast emptiness, like the first drops of rain after a season of drought. But it was a bitter homecoming. The halls that should have rung with celebration were filled instead with the evidence of the dragon's long malice, gold scattered like leaves in autumn, treasures trampled and tarnished, the beautiful things their ancestors had made reduced to mere hoard for a creature that valued only possession, never creation. The Arkenstone blazed in its chamber like a star fallen to earth, but even its light seemed dimmed by sorrow for all that had been lost. Thorin stood in the throne room of his fathers, where the great chair of Durin's line waited beneath a ceiling carved with the history of his people. Yet when he sat upon that ancient seat, crown upon his brow and scepter in his hand, he felt not triumph, but the crushing weight of all that must be rebuilt, all that could never be recovered. all the lives that had been lost in the long years of exile. "The kingdom under the mountain is restored," he proclaimed to the empty halls, his voice echoing strangely in chambers too vast for the few who had returned to claim them. "Let word go forth to all the dwarf kindreds that Erebor is reclaimed, that the line of Durin sits once more upon the throne of his fathers." But even as he spoke the words of victory, runners were bringing news that turned celebration to concern and joy to bitter necessity. From the north came the drums of the goblins, marching in numbers not seen since the great wars of the elder days. From the south came the armies of men, some to aid, but others drawn by tales of dragon gold and the prospect of claiming a share of the mountain's wealth by force of arms. Dain Ironfoot led his warriors from the Iron Hills in a forced march that covered the distance in days that should have taken weeks, for the ravens had brought word that Erebor was besieged before it was even properly reclaimed. The sound of his war horns echoed across the desolation as his iron-shod troops took their positions on the slopes of the mountain, their shields locked and their axes bright with oil of whetstone. The men of Lake Town, homeless now and led by bards the bowmen who had slain the dragon, came not as conquerors but as refugees seeking aid and allies. Their town lay in ruins, their livelihood destroyed, yet in their eyes burned the same fire that had guided Bard's arrow to its mark. The determination of those who have lost everything, yet refuse to surrender to despair. And from the north came Thranduil's host, the Elves of the wood armed with spear and bow, their king riding at their head with a crown of red leaves upon his brow. They marched to music that was older than the foundations of the mountain, songs that remembered the time before Smaug, before the dwarves delved so deep, before the shadow first fell across the world. The Battle of Five Armies, as it came to be known in song and story, was fought not for glory or dominion, but for something far more precious: the right of free peoples to live as they chose, to rebuild what had been torn down, to kindle new lights in places where darkness had reigned too long. Goblins and wargs poured down from the grey mountains like a plague of locusts, driven by hatred for all things that lived and grew and made music in the world. Yet they broke upon the alliance of dwarves and men and elves like waves upon stone. Thorin led his people from the mountain's gates in a charge that would be remembered until the ending of the world, his voice raised in the ancient battle cry of Durin's folk, his sword blazing with light that no shadow could endure. Beside him fought his nephews Fili and Kili, young princes who had found their courage in the deeps of the earth and their destiny on the field of battle. When the sun set on that day of war, the goblin host was scattered and their chieftains slain, but victory had come at a price that turned triumph to mourning. Thorin Oakenshield lay dying beneath the walls of his reclaimed kingdom, his sword broken in his hand, his crown dented but still upon his brow. In his last hours he made peace with those he had wronged, spoke words of friendship that healed old wounds, and passed from the world knowing that his people's long exile was ended. "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West," he whispered to Bilbo Baggins, the hobbit who had found courage in the darkness beneath the mountain and wisdom in the moment of choosing between gold and friendship. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. The king died as the first stars appeared above the lonely mountain, but he died knowing that his quest was complete, his people's birthright restored, their ancient home ready to ring once more with the sound of hammer and song. Dain took the crown and the throne, ruling justly and well, but none who were there would ever forget the king who had led them home through darkness and dragonfire to reclaim their heritage. Yet even as the dwarves mourned their fallen king and began the great work of rebuilding, other eyes watched from the shadows, and other minds calculated the shifting balance of power in the world. The dragon was dead, the mountain reclaimed, a kingdom restored, But these were only movements in a greater game. Pieces shifted on a board whose full pattern was not yet revealed. In Dol Guldur, abandoned now but not destroyed, dark birds gathered to nest in the ruins, and things that should not be began to stir in the deep places beneath the hill. The shadow had withdrawn, but shadows return, and what had been displaced would seek new vessels for its malice. The kingdom under the mountain was reclaimed, but the war for Middle-earth was only beginning. In the deepest root halls of the misty mountains, where goblin tunnels burrowed through stone that had never known the touch of sunlight, something stirred in the darkness that was not goblin, nor worm, nor any creature that drew breath in the upper world. For centuries uncounted it had crept and crawled through, passages forgotten by all save the things that dwelt in perpetual night, a remnant of older evils that had found refuge in the bones of the earth. Gollum, though that name was but an echo of what he had once been, pressed himself against the cold stone of his island in the underground lake, his great pale eyes reflecting what little phosphorescence gleamed from the water's surface. His precious was gone, lost somewhere in the dark tunnels above, and with its loss had come a grief so profound that it threatened to tear what remained of his sanity into tatters thinner than spider silk. "Lost," he whispered to the shadows that pressed close about him, his voice a sound like water dripping into stagnant pools. "Lost and gone forever, yes, precious, gone with the nasty, tricksy, false thief creature that came creeping in the dark." But even as he mourned, even as he cursed the name of Baggins with venom that would have poisoned the very stones, Gollum felt something stirring in the depths of his being. Not his own thought, but something else. Something that spoke with a voice he had not heard clearly for decades beyond counting. "Find me," whispered the ring from whatever distant place it now rested. "Find me, and be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. Find me, and all the hurts done to you shall be avenged tenfold." The call was not loud. Indeed, to most who might hear it, it would seem no more than the whisper of wind through empty halls, the echo of water dripping in forgotten caverns. But to one who had possessed the ring for so long, who had allowed its influence to seep into the very marrow of his bones, that whisper was clearer than the sound of thunder. Gollum's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a light that owed nothing to the phosphorescence of his underground realm. For the first time since his precious had been stolen, he felt purpose flow through his withered frame like fire through dry kindling. "Yes," he hissed, his long fingers clutching at the stone beneath him. "We hears it, precious. Yes, we hears it calling. It wants to come back to us. It knows its true master. The nasty thief creature cannot keeps it forever. No, precious, not forever." He began to move then, slipping from his island into the black water with barely a splash, swimming with the sinuous grace of something that had been shaped by centuries of life in the depths. Behind him, the underground lake rippled and was still, as if it had never known any inhabitant save the blind fish that swam in its deepest places. Far above, in a hobbit hole that was the very picture of comfortable respectability, Bilbo Baggins sat in his study after a particularly fine dinner, cleaning the dwarven blade he had taken to calling Sting. The sword, for sword it was, though short by the standards of men, gleamed in the lamplight, its elven runes catching the glow and holding it like captured starfire. He should have been content. His adventure was over, his quiet, life restored, his garden growing green again after his long absence. The neighbors had stopped whispering about his strange disappearance and stranger return, and even the most conservative hobbits of Hobbiton had begun to forget that Bilbo Baggins had ever been anything other than a perfectly respectable gentleman of leisure. Yet contentment eluded him. In quiet moments like this, when the business of daily life did not occupy his thoughts, he found his hand straying to the pocket where his ring rested, the golden ring he had found in the depths of the goblin tunnels, the ring that had proven so useful during his adventures, the ring that now seemed as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. Sometimes, in the deep of night when sleep would not come, he would take the ring from its hiding place and hold it up to catch what little light filtered through his curtains. It was beautiful, he thought, so perfectly wrought, so cunningly made that it seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. And when he slipped it upon his finger, when the world faded around him and he walked unseen through Hobbiton's lanes, he felt a freedom that no other experience could match. It was a harmless amusement, surely. A bit of magic that had saved his life more than once. A treasure that asked nothing of him save that he keep it safe and secret. What harm could there be in such a thing? But tonight, as he sat in his chair with Sting across his knees and the ring's weight heavy in his pocket, Bilbo felt something that made his blood run cold. For just a moment, so brief he might have imagined it, he felt watched. Not by earthly eyes peering through his windows, but by something vast and patient and utterly without mercy. Something that searched the world with a gaze that missed nothing and forgave less. The feeling passed as quickly as it had come, leaving him wondering if it had been real or merely the product of too much wine with dinner. But the ring seemed heavier in his pocket, as if it had somehow grown in weight during that moment of strange awareness. In the east, in the tower of Barad-dûr that pierced the red sky of Mordor like a black spear, the Dark Lord Sauron sat upon his throne of iron and malice. His form was wreathed in shadow and flame, beautiful and terrible as the Maiar had been in the early days of the world, before pride and the lust for dominion had corrupted his nature beyond all hope of redemption. Before him stretched the map of Middle-earth, marked with the positions of his servants and the movements of his enemies. Pieces on a board, all of them, kings and warriors, wizards and dragons, even the small folk of the Shire who thought themselves beneath the notice of the great powers of the world. But his attention was not fixed upon armies or fortresses, upon the movements of the wise or the schemes of the powerful. Instead, his thought turned westward, toward a land of green hills and comfortable holes, toward a creature so small and insignificant that none would think to guard against him, yet who bore upon his finger the key to all Sauron's designs. Soon he whispered to the darkness that pressed close about his throne. Soon the lost shall be found, the stolen shall be reclaimed, and when that day comes, all the free peoples of Middle-earth shall learn what it means to defy the will of Sauron the Great. The ring called to its master across the leagues that separated them, its voice growing stronger with each passing day. In goblin tunnels, a creature that had once been hobbit-like crept ever upward, following that call with single-minded devotion. In Bag End, another hobbit felt the first stirrings of an unease he could not name, a restlessness that no comfortable chair or well-stocked pantry could assuage. The ring still slept, but its sleep was the sleep of a seed in winter soil, waiting for the warmth that would wake it to terrible life. And when that awakening came, the war that had begun with the dragon's death would become something far greater and more terrible. A conflict that would decide not merely the fate of kingdoms, but the very nature of the world itself. In the darkness beneath the earth, in the comfort of a hobbit hole, in the malice of Barad-dûr, three threads of fate drew slowly together. The game that had begun in the depths of Dol Guldur was nearing its climax, and the time of small adventures was ending. The Age of the Ring had begun. The White Council came to Dol Guldur in the full glory of their power, no longer content to watch and wait while darkness gathered strength in that accursed place. Galadriel rode at their head, terrible in her beauty, her hair streaming like captured starlight, and Nenya blazing upon her hand with radiance that drove back the shadows for leagues about. Beside her came Elrond, bearing Vilya, whose power was like the breath of the west wind made manifest, and Saruman the White, his staff gleaming with authority that few in Middle-earth could gainsay. The very earth trembled beneath their approach, for they came not as they had in times past, carefully, cautiously, seeking to contain rather than destroy. This time they came as the Eldar had once ridden to war against Morgoth himself, wreathed in light and terrible purpose, their combined might focused like the edge of a blade upon the fortress that had harbored evil for too long. The black walls of Dol Guldur cracked at their coming, stones that had been mortared with malice crumbling as the light of the three touched them. The iron gates that had stood sealed for decades shrieked open as if some giant hand had torn them from their hinges, and from the passages beyond came sounds that spoke of ancient evil in full retreat. "He is gone," Saruman proclaimed, his voice carrying across the hill as he extended his senses into the fortress that had so long defied their efforts. "The necromancer has fled. His servants scatter like leaves before the storm, and his power in this place is broken." Yet even as he spoke the words of victory, Galadriel felt something that chilled her immortal heart. The fortress was indeed empty of the malice that had dwelt there, but that absence felt wrong somehow. Not the clean emptiness of purification, but the hollow feeling of a vessel that had been drained rather than cleansed. "Fled, yes," she said, her voice carrying notes of sorrow that had not sounded since the lamps of Valinor were darkened. "But fled to where, Lord Saruman, and at what cost to our own designs?" She dismounted from her white horse and walked alone through the shattered gates, her light driving back shadows that tried to cling to the walls like living things. The others followed, but she moved ahead of them, her senses reaching out to touch the residual malice that lingered in every stone, every timber, every scrap of mortar that held the fortress together. The throne room stood empty, its black iron seat cold and lifeless, yet she could feel the echo of the presence that had so recently occupied it. Not the lesser evil they had believed themselves to be facing, but something far greater and more terrible, a malice that had roots reaching back to the very foundations of the world. "Sauron," she whispered, and the name seemed to hang in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell. It was Sauron who dwelt here, not some necromancer drunk on stolen power. And now he has withdrawn to his ancient fastness, warned of our purpose, and prepared for the war to come. Elrond joined her beside the empty throne, his face grave as he contemplated the implications of what they had discovered. "Then our victory here is hollow indeed. We have driven him from one stronghold only to see him take refuge in another, greater and more terrible than this could ever be." "Not hollow," Galadriel replied, though her voice carried little conviction. "We have broken his power in the south, scattered his immediate servants, cleansed a place of evil from the borders of your realm and mine. But you speak truly. This is but the end of a chapter, not the close of the book itself." They spent 3 days in the cleansing of Dol Guldur, using their combined might to burn away every trace of the shadow's influence, to break the spells that had been woven into its very foundations, to ensure that no lesser evil could easily take root in what the greater evil had abandoned. The work was exhausting, draining power that had been centuries in the building. Yet they persevered until the last echo of malice had been driven from the hill. When it was done, Dol Guldur stood empty and cleansed, its walls white in the sunlight that touched them for the first time in decades. Birds began to nest again in its towers, green things pushed up through cracks in its courtyards, and the very air seemed to sing with relief at the lifting of the burden that had pressed upon it for so long. Yet even as they celebrated this victory, each member of Amatewa and Dir's council felt the weight of what they had inadvertently accomplished. In forcing Sauron from Dol Guldur, they had driven him to reveal himself fully, to abandon the pretense of being merely a necromancer, and take on once again the full majesty and terror of his true nature. "We have forced his hand," Saruman observed as they prepared to depart, his white robe stirring in a wind that carried no hint of shadow. No longer can he work in secret, gathering strength while we debate and delay. He must move openly now, declare himself to friend and foe alike. And is that wisdom or folly? Elrond asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. A cornered beast is often more dangerous than one that hunts at leisure. Galadriel said nothing, but in her heart she felt the weight of futures glimpsed in the mirror's depths, of paths that led through darkness toward ends she could not clearly see. They had won a victory here, yes, but it was the kind of victory that sometimes presaged defeat, the triumph that comes too easily, the success that serves the enemy's purpose better than failure might have done. As they rode away from the cleansed hill, leaving it to the birds and the growing things that would reclaim it in time, each carried with them the knowledge that the real war was only beginning. They had lit a beacon that would rally the forces of light, but they had also awakened a malice that would not rest until every such beacon was extinguished forever. Behind them, Dol Guldur stood empty beneath the sky, its stones white and clean in the afternoon sun. But in the east, beyond the horizon where their sight could not reach, other stones were rising, black stones that drank light instead of reflecting it, towers that pierced the sky like spears thrust up from the very pit of hell. The enemy had withdrawn, but withdrawal was not defeat. And in his ancient stronghold of Barad-dûr, Sauron the Great began the work of forging the instruments of his vengeance, secure in the knowledge that his greatest weapon lay not in the strength of armies or the craft of fortress builders, but in a simple golden ring that rested in the pocket of a hobbit who had no idea of the power he carried. The cleansing of Dol Guldur would be remembered as a great victory, but history would judge whether it was wisdom or folly that drove the shadow from its hiding place and forced it to show its true face to the world. In the grey hours before dawn, when the world lies balanced between night and day, and all possibilities seem to hang in the air like mist above still water, Galadriel walked alone in the malin groves of Lothlórien. The great trees rose about her like pillars in some vast cathedral, their golden leaves whispering secrets in the ancient tongue, their roots drinking deep from waters that remembered the light of the two trees. She had returned from Dol Guldur heavy with the weight of victory that felt like defeat, bearing knowledge that sat upon her spirit like a stone. The shadow was revealed, the pretense ended, the careful plans of centuries brought to their moment of testing. All across Middle-earth, the pieces were moving toward their final positions on the great board where the fate of the world would be decided. Yet here, in this sanctuary, she had wrought from memory and longing and the last pure light that remained in the circles of the world. Galadriel found her thoughts turning not to the mighty and their designs, but to the small and the seemingly insignificant. To a hobbit in his comfortable hole, unaware that he carried the key to all their hopes. To another hobbit, yet unborn, whose hands would prove stronger than armies when the test came at last. The mirror stood still and dark beside her, its surface reflecting not the malin leaves overhead, but visions of what was and what might yet be. In its depths, she saw 1,000 paths branching like the veins of a leaf, some leading to darkness absolute, others to light reborn, but all threading through the choices of creatures so small that the great powers barely noticed their existence. Small hands, she whispered to the morning wind, remembering words spoken long ago by one wiser than she. And feet that make no sound. Such things shall accomplish what all the wisdom of the Eldar and all the might of men cannot achieve. The wind brought her the sound of music from the city in the trees, not the grand harmonies that had once echoed in the halls of Valinor, but something simpler and perhaps more precious for its simplicity. The voices of her people raised in song that spoke not of glory or conquest, but of small things beloved. The taste of Lember's bread, the sound of water over stones, the touch of sunlight through leaves on a summer afternoon. Such songs would be sung as long as the Eldar remained in Middle-earth, but Galadriel knew that their time was ending. Already she could feel the pull of the straight road that led west over the sea, the call of havens where the light did not fail and the shadow could never come. When the great test was over, however it might end, she would answer that call and pass over the water to lands beyond the reach of time and change. But not yet. Not while the ring remained in Middle-earth, not while its power could be turned to good or ill according to the heart that wielded it. Her vigil would continue until the end, whether that end brought victory or defeat, hope fulfilled or hope extinguished forever. In his study at Bag End, Bilbo Baggins finished the last lines of his book, setting down his pen with the satisfaction that came from work well done. There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale, would never be counted among the great works of literature, but it was honest in its way, telling the truth as he remembered it, though he had left out certain details that seemed too personal to share, certain discoveries that felt too precious for common eyes. His hand strayed to his pocket, feeling the familiar weight of the golden ring, and for a moment he saw again the goblin tunnels where he had found it, heard again the hissing voice of the creature who had called it precious with such desperate longing. He wondered sometimes what had become of that wretched being, whether it still crept through the darkness beneath the mountains, searching for what it had lost. A pang of something that might have been guilt touched his heart, but he pushed it aside. The ring was his by right of finding, was it not? And he had used it well, had he not? No harm had come from his possession of it. No evil had been worked by its power. It was a secret he shared with no one, a comfort in times of loneliness, a wonder that made the ordinary world seem touched with magic. Outside his window, the Shire lay peaceful in the morning light, its gardens green and its chimneys smoking with the cheerful smoke of breakfast fires. Here was innocence still, here was peace preserved by distance and obscurity, and the simple fact that few in the wide world thought hobbits worth the trouble of conquest. But for how long? Already there were rumors in the taverns of Bywater, tales brought by big folk from the east, stories of dark things stirring, of armies gathering in lands with strange names, of kings and wizards preparing for wars that common folk could barely imagine. The hobbits listened to such tales with the comfortable certainty that such grand affairs had nothing to do with them, that the troubles of the great world would pass them by as they always had. How little they knew, how little any of them knew. In the timeless halls where the Valar dwelt in light beyond the circles of the world, Manwë the Wind Lord stood upon the highest peak of Taniquetil and gazed eastward toward the lands of Middle-earth. His sight pierced all veils, saw past all deceits, and in his eyes was sadness for what was and what must be. Beside him stood Vada Elentari, she who kindled the stars and set them in their courses, and her face was grave as she contemplated the patterns that were taking shape in the tapestry of fate. The music that had begun in the timeless halls was nearing its crescendo, the discord that Melkor had woven into its harmony, approaching the moment when it would either be resolved or destroy all that had been made. "Will they prove strong enough?" she asked, though she spoke not of kings or wizards, or the great powers of the earth, but of simpler folk, farmers and millers, gardeners and innkeepers, the quiet people who asked nothing more of life than the right to live it in peace. "They will prove what they are," Manwë replied, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and the sorrow of knowledge. "No more and no less, and in their proving all shall be revealed, whether the children of Ilúvatar have learned wisdom from their long exile, or whether they must drink the cup of sorrow to its dregs before the healing comes." The conversation of the Valar was not in words as mortals understand them, but in harmonies that shape the very foundations of existence. Yet, if their meaning could be rendered in the speech of Middle-earth, it might have sounded something like hope, not the bright hope of those who have never known defeat, but the deeper hope of those who have looked into the darkness and chosen to kindle light anyway. For in the end, that was what the Third Age would be remembered for. Not the great deeds of kings and warriors, though such deeds would be done, but for the choice made again and again by small folk in quiet moments. The decision to be kind when kindness seemed foolish, to be brave when bravery seemed hopeless, to trust when trust seemed certain to be betrayed. The sun rose higher over Middle-earth, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, driving back the shadows that had crept across the land in the watches of the night. In Lothlórien, Galadriel lifted her face to that light and felt in it an echo of the radiance that had once illuminated Valinor in its glory. In the Shire, Bilbo closed his book and went to tend his garden, humming a tune that had no words but spoke of contentment and simple joy. And in the darkness beneath the mountains, in the malice of Mordor, in all the places where shadow gathered and hatred brooded, the light of that sunrise was felt as a reproach and a challenge. The forces of darkness had their own strength, their own certainty, their own designs for the remaking of the world, but they had reckoned without the hobbits, and in that failure of imagination laid the seed of their undoing, though many dark years would pass before that seed grew to fruition. The tears of Galadriel had fallen, and in their falling had watered the ground where hope would grow. The day the Lady of Light wept for Middle-earth's fate was the day that fate began to turn, though none who lived would see the full flowering of what had been planted in sorrow and tended with sacrifice. The Age of the Ring had begun, but it would not be the ring that decided its ending. It would be small hands, small feet, small hearts that proved greater than all the malice in the world, and in that knowledge there was hope indeed. Thus ends the tale of the tears of Galadriel, as it was written in the Red Book of Westmarch, and as it was sung in the halls of the Eldar, until the last ship sailed from the Grey Havens, and the elder days passed into memory and myth.